It's the 28th of June 1934, and Chancellor of Germany Adolf Hitler has just called for a conference. It will involve the top leaders of the Nazi Party's paramilitary force, the Sturmabteilung or SA, also known as the Brown Shirts. In the early morning of June 30th, when the conference is just hours from supposedly starting, Hitler unexpectedly arrives at the hotel where many of these leaders are staying, for there was no actual conference planned. Instead, these men, now gathered in one place, are arrested and swiftly executed in what would become known as the Night of the Long Knives. The SA had played a big role in helping Hitler rise to power, but by now he had come to see their thuggish and radical ways as not just a nuisance, but a threat to his authority. No one was more dangerous to him than Ernst Röhm, the SA's leader and one of Hitler's longest allies. Knowing that he had to keep the aging President Hindenburg on his side, and well aware that he could even be removed from power if he didn't bring the SA into line, Hitler made the decision that Röhm had to go. Today we will look at this infamous purge, the assassination of Röhm, and how the killings and their justification would foreshadow all of the Nazi atrocities and horrors that would later follow. We'll begin by looking at the rise of Röhm, the SA, and why Hitler eventually felt he needed to get rid of them. Like Hitler, Ernst Röhm had served in the First World War and was bitter over Germany's collapse. After the war, he joined one of the many Freikorps groups that were beginning to spring up across Germany. These street paramilitaries of former soldiers fought socialists, communists, and others that they believed had stabbed Germany in the back and had been responsible for their loss in the war. In 1919, Röhm joined the German Workers' Party. The same year it was also joined by one Adolf Hitler. This group, of course, would eventually become the Nazi Party. As it slowly began to grow, it was in need of muscle to both protect its own meetings and affairs and sabotage those of its rivals. As such, the SA was born, and Röhm quickly got to work shaping it into a force to be reckoned with. Using his military connections to funnel money and weapons into the group's hands, he began developing the SA further by drawing in large amounts of its members from the Freikorps. These were often disaffected and unemployed young men who shared a similar sense of bitterness and were opposed to the new republic. In 1923, Hitler attempted to seize power in a coup that became known as the Munich Putsch. It failed, and as a result he and several Nazi leaders were arrested, the SA was banned, and following some disagreements, Röhm left the party altogether. Now it's important to understand with the SA, and this is a key reason why they fell out of favour, that they were not unquestionably loyal to Hitler. The SA had a revolutionary zeal to it, and when Hitler got out of prison and decided to try and pursue power through legal means, many of the members of the newly reformed SA were strongly opposed to it. In 1930, parts of the SA attempted to stage a revolt against Hitler. After this failed, he reached out to his old friend Röhm, asking him to return and bring the group under control. Unfortunately for him, Röhm would do quite the opposite. By the early 30s, Germany was in the grip of the Great Depression, a severe economic downturn that saw poverty and unemployment skyrocket. The SA saw even more opportunity to recruit, and its ranks began swelling faster than ever before. After Hitler was elected Chancellor in 1933, this accelerated even faster, and a year later it reached a peak of around 4 million members. But there was a problem. For now that the Nazi Party were in power, Hitler needed the support of the conservative establishment and military in order to move Germany towards the dictatorship he had always craved. The SA's disorder and street brawling was by now tarnishing the Nazis' image and threatening Hitler's standing with these groups. What made the matter all the more pressing for these elites was that Röhm frequently spoke of a second revolution. He wanted the SA to absorb the much smaller German armed forces, remove the traditional class of military officers, and establish a new revolutionary army with himself as its leader. For the officers, the idea of the military being subjugated to this band of thuggish brutes was intolerable. By mid-1934, The ailing President Hindenburg, who was now the only person that could still remove Hitler from power, gave his Chancellor an ultimatum: sort out the SA, or the country would be placed under martial law. At this point, the military was capped at 100,000 men due to the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War, but for his future plans of rearmament and military expansion, Hitler needed them on his side. These goals were something that his far larger but ill-disciplined and unprofessional SA simply were not equipped for. Hitler now realised the task at hand: betray one of his strongest allies, and then the path to ultimate power would be wide open. Röhm's days were numbered. In June 1934, Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen gave a speech damning some of the authoritarian actions of Hitler's government, in particular the conduct of the SA. Hitler was angered, but along with the threat from Hindenburg, was also now well aware that he had to move quickly to stay in power. On June the 28th, Hitler called a meeting of SA leaders in the Bavarian spa town of Bad Wiessee for 2 days later, a place where Röhm was already on holiday. Of course, this was a trap, to gather as many of them as possible in one place and deal with them efficiently. In preparation for the purge, other senior Nazi leaders Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich prepared a dossier of manufactured evidence claiming that Röhm had been paid by the French to overthrow the government. Both of them had much to gain from Röhm's downfall. They were leaders in the SS, a much more selective group than the SA that up to this point had mainly served as Hitler's personal protection squadron. Although they were technically underneath the SA, the SS was designed to be fiercely loyal to Hitler, in contrast to the SA's more radical and divergent stance. This made them the perfect tool to carry out this task. The meeting of SA leaders was scheduled for 11 AM on June the 30th. Bright and early that morning, Hitler and members of the SS stormed the Hanselbauer Hotel whilst most of the SA leaders were still in bed. Room by room, the SA's leaders were arrested, whilst Röhm was arrested by Hitler himself. Röhm's deputy Edmund Heinz was one of these, and had been found in bed with an 18-year-old man. Homosexuality was present within the SA, and this included Röhm himself, whose sexuality was known to both Nazi leaders and political opponents. There is some conflicting testimony as to whether Heinz was taken outside and shot right there, or if he was later executed in prison. Either way, the Nazis later exploited this fact about some of the SA's leaders to justify the purge. The leaders from the hotel were then taken to Munich's Stadelheim prison, facing torture and eventual execution. Given Röhm's long years of service to Hitler and the party, he was handed a pistol in his cell and given the option of suicide. He flat out refused, and so 10 minutes later the guards simply returned and executed him at the age of 46. Hitler's most dangerous internal rival, a man who had been by his side for almost 15 years, had now been dealt with. But Röhm and the Bad Wiessee group was merely the tip of the iceberg, for the purge was soon to expand, setting an awful precedent that would shape the next decade of the Nazis' tyrannical rule. The arrest of Röhm, Heinz, and the other SA leaders at Bad Wiessee proved to be the starting gun for a wider purge that would seize the group's representatives all across Germany. From Berlin, another one of Hitler's deputies, Hermann Göring, got to work. A few weeks earlier, Göring, Himmler, and Heydrich had drawn up the Reich list of unwanted persons. This was an opportunistic move to kill two birds with one stone, and wipe out other political opponents and non-SA targets at the same time. Among those in the crosshairs were Gregor Strasser, a former high-ranking Nazi who had later schemed against Hitler, and Kurt von Schleicher, the man who had preceded Hitler as Chancellor. Both of them were named in Heydrich's dossier as conspiring with Röhm to overthrow the Nazi government, and both became victims of the purge. Having spoken out against Hitler just 2 weeks earlier, Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen was placed under house arrest but escaped the same deadly fate as the others. By the time the Night of the Long Knives finally came to an end on July the 2nd, scores of Hitler's opponents lay dead across Germany. It's not quite known exactly how many were murdered, but it's thought that the number could possibly be in the hundreds, Röhm simply having been the centerpiece for a wave of brutality that had stretched far beyond him. Nevertheless, President Hindenburg thanked Hitler for dealing with the SA threat. The purge was officially announced by Hitler himself days afterwards on July the 13th. Addressing the German parliament, the Reichstag, he claimed that the actions taken had been necessary to protect the German nation from treasonous acts. This set a terrible precedent. If murder was now a legitimate action in the name of supposedly protecting the state and the German people, then the rule of law itself was now effectively obsolete. Germany was now accelerating down a dark path, and from the atrocities that the regime would later commit, we now know exactly where it led to. Meanwhile, the military were both relieved that Röhm and the SA had been dealt with, and impressed at Hitler's efficiency in dealing with the problem. They pledged to support Hitler in his bid to become president, with it being no secret by this point that the 85-year-old Hindenburg did not have long left. Hindenburg died on the 2nd of August, and with the military support, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President to become the Führer. At the same time, inspired by Hitler's plans of rearmament and driven by old Prussian military tradition, the armed forces took it on themselves to swear a personal oath to the Führer. With this, the last avenues to prevent a Nazi dictatorship effectively vanished. However, although the SA's back had been broken, the Nazis still needed a reliable paramilitary force. This role, of course, came to be filled by the infamous SS. In contrast with the SA's drunken street brawls, Himmler and Heydrich built the SS into a much more systematic machine of terror. The SS promptly began to take over law enforcement and secret police organs across Germany, established concentration camps, and formed a combat branch, the Waffen-SS. Not only did Hitler now have absolute power, but he also had the tool that he would use to carry out his most twisted actions, and crucially, their absolute loyalty. The Night of the Long Knives proved to be one of the most pivotal moments in the establishment of Nazi Germany. In wiping out his rival and former close ally Ernst Röhm, Hitler achieved three things. The ruthless elimination of his rivals, both within the Nazi party and outside of it, proving that he would stop at nothing in his drive for dictatorial power. The confidence of the military and much of the German political establishment, which would serve as a springboard for him to become the Führer. And finally, the rise of the SS, the loyal paramilitary he craved, and who would serve as the tool to carry out his most horrifying and genocidal ambitions. Those 3 days in 1934, and the assassination of Ernst Röhm, had proven the key to it all. As always, we hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more from the Assassinations Archive.